Participles, what are they? Well, a participle is a verbal. So what is a verbal? A verbal is a word that looks like a verb, but it's not a verb. So a verbal will be some kind of action, believing, studying, hitting, fighting, running. But the distinction between a verb and a verbal is that a verb has a subject and a verbal will never have a subject. So that's the distinction that we have to keep in mind. In English, we talk about three kinds of verbals: participles, which usually end in ing. So in English, you want to look for ing words. Participles always end in ing. And infinitives are the easiest to find because they are always in this form: to plus a verb, to run, to hit, to read, etc. So again, an important thing to remember here is that when looking for gerunds and participles, look for ing, words that end in ing. That won't always be the case, but it's usually the case. And infinitives, look for the preposition to with a verb. Now, if you have the preposition to with a noun, you have a prepositional phrase, not an infinitive. But when you have to plus a verb, you have an infinitive. Now, a participle is a verbal adjective. So what is a verbal adjective? Well, a verbal adjective is a verbal that's functioning as an adjective. That's all there is to it. So if you'll remember the adjectival questions, which one, what kind, and how many, this verbal, a participle, will be answering one of those three questions. Now, we distinguish participles from gerunds. Gerunds are verbal nouns, which simply means that this is a verbal that's functioning as a substantive. It will be a subject, an object, or a predicate nominative. So that's the difference between a gerund and a participle. Gerunds are substantives, they're nouns, they function as nouns. Participles are adjectives, they function as adjectives. So here's a verse of scripture, and notice this noun right here. And what do we know about this noun? Well, we know that this noun is a running, alone. But look at, running isn't a pure adjective. There's this action implied here. There's running. The man here is running. It's an action. But notice that this verbal here does not have a subject. So this then is a participle or a verbal, and it is modifying the noun man, and therefore it's a verbal adjective, and therefore it's a participle. Another example here. Saul and they, the they here is referring to David's brothers. Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. Now, if I look at Saul and they and men, these are all subjects of this verb here, were. Saul, they, men, were. So what is this here, fighting? Well, again, you can see there's an action involved here. Fighting. Notice the ing. And notice, too, that it's Saul and they and men who are fighting. So we see the verbal. We're clued off to the fact that this is a verbal by the ing at the end of this word. We notice that it's modifying. It's telling us more about Saul, they, and men. These are all nouns. And therefore, fighting is a verbal adjective or a participle. Now, participles don't have to stand alone. Participles can be part of a phrase. So when we see this participle, to go back to this one again, fighting is definitely the participle. It's a verbal. But fighting is modified by this phrase here, with the Philistines. In fact, if you think about the adverbial questions, when, where, how, and why, you'll see that with the Philistines is answering the where question. Where was he fighting? Well, he was fighting with the Philistines. So this adverbial prepositional phrase here is modifying fighting, which means that this whole phrase, fighting with the Philistines, is what we call a participial phrase, called a participial phrase because it begins with a participle. So this whole phrase actually then is functioning as an adjective modifying Saul, they, and men. The whole phrase is functioning as a unit, and that unit is an adjectival unit. Just like with the Philistines is a phrase as well, a prepositional phrase because it begins with a preposition. And this time, this unit of language is functioning adverbially, telling us where the fighting was taking place. Another participial phrase. I believe this is from one of the prophets, Isaiah maybe. And you'll notice that here we have watchmen. They're blind. They're all without knowledge. They're all silent dogs. They cannot bark, dreaming, lying down, loving slumber. Here you have three participles, dreaming, lying down, and loving slumber. But only this word is the participle, loving, lying, dreaming. But here, lying where? Well, lying down. But look at this one. So here you have an adverb modifying lying. But here you have loving. And loving what? Well, loving slumber. And you'll remember that when you ask what, you're generally asking for the object. Well, here, the watchman loving slumber. So loving slumber is the participial phrase then. It's called a participial phrase because it begins with a participle. And it's called a participle because it's functioning as an adjective, and adjectives modify nouns. And this participial phrase is modifying the pronoun they. Now, to distinguish a participle from a gerund is not as easy as it may sound. Again, both of them can begin with an ing word. Both of them end in ing. Not all the time, but sometimes. So studying theology here, how do you know if that's a participle or is it a gerund? Well, again, we have to go back to the fact that a participle is an adjective and a gerund is a noun or a substantive. So if it's a participle, then we know it's going to be modifying some noun. If it's a gerund, then we know it's going to be performing one of those noun functions, either a subject, an object, predicate, nominative. So when we look at studying theology here, we have to ask ourselves, if it's a participle, what noun is it modifying? If it's a gerund, what noun function is it performing? Well, it's very obvious here that studying theology is the subject of this verb is. And since it's a subject, and since subject is a noun function, and since gerunds perform a noun function, studying theology here is a gerund. If I take the exact same phrase in a different sentence, studying theology, Jeb began to neglect his family responsibilities. It's the exact same phrase, studying theology, but now we can clearly see that it's telling us more about this noun right here, Jeb. Jeb is the one who's studying theology. Yeah, you might think of it this way. He's the studying theology Jeb. That helps you see the adjectival nature of that phrase more clearly when you phrase it that way, the studying theology Jeb. And he began to neglect his family responsibilities. So studying theology is a participle modifying the noun Jeb. And that's how we know that this is a participle and this is a gerund.